Right. So I want to say I enjoyed your piece in particular because of two reasons. One is the way you wrote it. Although it took me a second to see that, it's really a continuation of the Zohar, is the way you did it. In other words, you basically the first paragraph is sort of a continuation of a primary source, transforming that midrash into the Zohar in the Zohar into one of those reciprocal midrashes. Like Situni Chativa Chat Ba'olam. And that created a very interesting mirror image in other words, you took the story using that midrashic sort of paradigm, which created this interesting reciprocal sort of mirror image. And that revealed a whole different take on that piece in the Zohar than the one I had in my head.
Yes, that is true. But I want to say, first of all, thank you for putting me in that kind of constellation. But I also want to say that it was important for me for your piece to be woven into the Zohar and for it to be a prism of the mirrors.
Right.
And that is why I start with, you conclude with, an ancient people stands again in prayer and in celebration before the glory of God. And I start where you ended and flip it in that way, right? An internal God stands again in prayer and in celebration before the glory of his people.
Right. Yeah.
So I really wanted to bring in your piece as a continuation, as another layer or mirror or prism of the Zohar, and then to enter into the conversation from there.
Right, right.
And it's a way in which, in some way, I find on Skype, it doesn't do what mirrors do, because mirrors, they shift your vision. But on Skype, I always find that actually what I'm right now experiencing is my right hand appears on the left side of the screen.
Oh, wait a minute. No, mine. If it was a mirror, I'm looking at my right hand. It's on the right side of the screen. Yours
in
is
a
that
mirror.
Your right or your left?
This is my right hand.
Oh, it's on the left of my screen.
It's on the left of my screen as well. But in a mirror, it would be on the right side.
But mine, when I hold up my right side, it's on the right side. That's weird. Can you see my picture?
I see your picture, and I see your right hand on the left. You're sitting opposite me.
Right. Okay.
I'm sitting in front of me.
You're sitting right.
That's how it appears, right? So I'm experiencing my right hand, but I see it on the left side.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
So that's how I read the Zohar with your piece inside of it. It's a flip. Right? There's the if you look, I remember taking a picture once of seeing actually the negative of wedding pictures of a dear friend of mine. Mm-hmm. Now, if you can imagine this image, it's a wedding picture. She's walking to the chuppah. But in the time of negatives, when pictures were taken on film negatives, you see two images with a person dressed in black walking between them.
Because the shape they created between them made it look like a person.
In the negative, and the film negative, the black is the white in reality.
Right. But it's interesting that it made a human shape. It could be any shape in between the
No, well, it was a picture of the bride. It was a photograph.
Oh, I see. It was her negative. I thought it was in between them. Yeah.
No, it was the film negative. When it's produced, when it's developed, it becomes a white wedding dress.
Right.
But the film negative, it's a black wedding dress. It was very startling.
Yeah.
And I thought to myself, okay, lo bichti, Moshe tiken shiva yemei mishte and shiva yemei avelud. Right? There's a reason why they're connected in so many different traditions, weddings and funerals. So in the same way, I feel that we don't pause often enough for me to think about the aspect of the divine going through this time. In the same way, we're speaking now, and it's Erev Shabbat Nachamu.
Right.
And when we say Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, V'mar Hashem Elokechem, be consoled my people, the pshat is that God is consoling us, or God is speaking to us. But I read those psukim as Nachamu, Nachamu Ami, my people, console me.
Nice. Yeah.
Right? after God went through Tisha B'Av, after God sees us mourning, after God sees the destruction of the Mikdash and the implications of 2,000 years of exile.
Sha'ol Yishag al Nevehu. That whole emphasis of God's suffering.
Yes, but we don't think of that. We don't pause often to think about what does it mean to be a suffering parent? What does it mean to be a suffering God? How does God go through, right, the inevitability? If God forbid, when you have to do something painful with one of your children, you do it because you're a parent.
Right.
And you're obligated to in terms of their well-being. But it still hurts you.
Right.
So who is that going to be, that hand that puts their hand on your shoulder to support you as what you're doing is actually protecting your child even though it appears to be inflicting pain?
Right.
And there is a vulnerability. When we say, En melech belo am, there isn't a king without a nation. When one of the interpretations of the Me'orinayim, the Chernobyl Rebbe, on Kedoshim to you, ki kadosh ani Hashem Elokechem, you shall be holy because I, your God, am holy, is a theurgic explanation, and that God's holiness is dependent on our holiness. And God's holiness manifests in the world based on our actions and our holiness. That's an image of a very vulnerable God.
And it created an interesting effect on the page, because I assume you saw, did you see Avi Kilip's piece on the in other words, the one just before yours in the commentaries around the Zohar is Avi Kilip, and she responded to the piece, emphasizing the masculine image of God in the picture, and pointing out that that's both in some ways a comforting image of the powerful God raising his arm to remove Israel / the Shekhinah from the dust of evil, right, from the structure, from the suffering in the world, but that arm also looks to her like an arm that's ready to strike. And so there's a quality here also of a threat of violence, which I think is there. In other words, I hear that in the text in some ways.
Yes, and definitely in your reading for sure.
Right. But then when in the way you read it, by making it reciprocal, you did two things. One is you reversed the image all of a sudden, so now we're talking about God experience and not about our experience in that sense. Although the Zohar, obviously, in that sense, is talking about both, right? But you focused on the way that, just like we're talking about the right hand versus left hand, that it gets reversed, you focused on the vulnerable aspect of God vis-a-vis us. So in other words, now what Avi said is still true, but the person who might be in fear of being hit, in a sense, would be God, and we're the ones now that are potentially dangerous, because God is vulnerable and waiting to see how we're going to respond on Rosh Hashanah, as opposed to we being vulnerable and waiting to see how God is going to respond on Rosh Hashanah. So I thought that the combination of your piece and hers made the way you flipped it, the way you made a mirror image of the picture, even sort of more, clearly profound, in that it highlighted the what she's pointing out as this problematic nature of the relationship going one way, and now we see it's also problematic going the other way, which also addresses what was bothering her, I think, in some ways.
Potentially, it's true. When I allude to Rabbi Yochanan extending his hand, right. So I share this teaching with my seniors, actually, in our last year, when we deal with the sugya v'surim shel ahava, afflictions of love, and talking about with my students, especially when they come back from their chaplaincy. Those who do CPE throughout the summer, they have 2 months of chaplaincy, and one of the things that's hard to imagine emotionally, I think, in the first moment, but then it completely falls into place, is that when you walk into the hospital room to visit a patient, they can tell you go away. The chaplain is the only person that walks in to offer a service that they can say, I don't want you. A doctor will walk in, a nurse will walk in, and whatever they want to do to your body, they will do, and they have the authority to do. The one person that you can say, I don't want you in my room, the one person in their presence they can assert their autonomy is the chaplain.
It's the chaplain, right.
So when you extend your hand,
Uh-huh.
one of your friends says, Havli yadeh, give me your hand.
Right.
The one prerogative they can say is, go away.
Right.
I'm not ready to talk to you in terms of the chaplaincy. I'm not ready to be healed, or I'm not ready to leave my mourning. I'm not ready.
And that's the lohem velo scharam? Not them and not their reward.
Correct. And when Una says in Sanhedrin, Yeti velo chimna,
Right.
Mashiach will come and I will not see it.
Right.
Because Una says, if this is the destruction, you look at the Pesach Rebbe on Shabbat Parshat Chazon.
Right.
He says, if this is what it's going to cost for Mashiach to come, not interested.
Right. But then in your piece is the implication of God being afraid. In other words, if God then in your piece is in the role of the chaplain in a way, when he comes to us.
Correct.
So then what would I was curious, in other words, when we would say about the Yisurim Shel Ahava, the suffering, what do you say, suffering from love, affliction from love, in your piece, God is afraid that we might say, we don't want that or its reward. But does that suggest, in a sense, that our essential relationship with God includes these Yisurim, this suffering, and that's what we'd be rejecting if we rejected God? I wasn't sure how to read that aspect of what you wrote.
Well, I think for me the core piece is there's a vulnerability element that I want to bring in.
Right.
And that when talking about a relationship, there has to be a sense of mutual vulnerability.
The willingness to accept suffering.
The willingness to accept suffering, or the willingness to be willing to enter into a conversation about the meaning of suffering.
And so if we say to God, we don't want that or its reward, in a sense we're saying we're not willing to be vulnerable in this relationship.
In that way, for sure.
Right.
And I want to say, I think for each one of us, we have in our lives a concept of what Yisurim Shel Ahava is. When I work with our seniors, especially the ones that I sponsor towards their ordination, they have to do a writing piece for me. And one of the questions that I ask them is, what is your Yisurim Shel Ahava? Because the Gemara there says we have two opinions. Kol she'en beim bitul Torah v'kol she'en beim bitul tefillah. One says, I can endure anything as long as I can daven. One says, I can endure anything as long as I can pray.
Right.
I think we each have that in ourselves. I can be in a relationship with the divine as long as I can. What is that for you? As long as
I have to be willing to put myself on the line. I have to be willing to lose something in order to have that, in a sense. In other words, what God's vulnerability in your piece is that we'll be unwilling to accept that upon ourselves, our own vulnerability in that relationship, in a way. Is that?
There is a moment when our integrity is compromised to the extent where I cannot be in the relationship. And the
God's
trust,
afraid.
The trust there is.
We'll reach that point.
Yes, or I want to say that we trust the divine by enabling the divine to know us.
Right.
And to say to the Master World, I am on board forever.
Right.
No matter what.
Right.
There's only one deal breaker. You need to know.
The loss of communication between us, which would be prayer.
For sure.
Right. But you're saying each person has to say what that deal breaker is for themselves also.
Correct. For one, it was in the Gemara, it's Tefillah or Talmud Torah.
Right.
Right? For as long as, I don't know, maybe it's as long as I can feel compassion towards others suffering. Right? If I come to a place of suffering that I shut down towards others suffering, I can't live in that world.
Right.
If I live in a world in which I cannot be the parent I want to be for my children, I can't be in that world. You know, the Rebbe, there's a wonderful story of one of the Rebbes, and I don't remember which one it is, when the doctor told him, maybe it's the Pshischa, when the doctor told him that if he doesn't stop reading, he'll lose his vision. And the Rebbe said, if I can't learn, what do I need my eyes for?
Right.
So each one of us has that element of what that Yisurim Shalava, what those afflictions of love would look like.
Right.
So there's elements of strength. There's a vulnerability and there's a strength simultaneously. Because if you can share to someone what your deal breaker is, that means that you actually believe that they have a way of responding in a means that will enable the relationship to be forever.
Right. And so Hashem's vulnerability in the way you're imagining it, in a sense, is our unwillingness to enter into that place, to share that knowledge of ourselves with him or with her. And that's, in a sense, the reciprocal vulnerability that gets set up in the piece as you read it.
Yes, and the not knowing that the divine carries. I love the fact, the God of the Gemara, my Matzli,
right.
When the Gemara says, "Minay shekadosh baruch hu mitpalel,"
right.
How do we know that God prays?
Right.
Because they bring the pasuk, Beit Tfilati, right? We just read that the haftarah of Tisha B'Av Mincha.
And also the midrash that your piece reminded me of the Mikam Chai Yisrael Goy Echad Ba'aretz. In other words, what's in God's tefillin. That's the first thing that came to mind when I read your piece.
Right. So in the Gemara, God prays on that page in Brachot, right, 7a, God prays, Yehi ratzon milfanai sheyichbeshu rachamai et ka'asi. That's the beginning of his prayer.
Right.
May it be in front of me that my compassion overcomes my anger. That's the God of the Gemara praying.
Right.
But the prayer of the Mea Shiloach is, Halvai techavnu le'omek retzoni v'telchu bechukotai. Right? But the prayer, that's what he says.
So he's not. So the God of the Gemara is actually talking to himself about himself, whereas the Mea Shiloach is talking to Israel.
Well, he's praying to Israel.
Right.
And even if you want to say that he's praying to himself,
right.
What is his prayer? His prayer is, I pray that you understand what I'm saying.
Right.
I pray that when I show up on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, that you can also see my vulnerability. I stand as king, I stand as ruler, I stand as creator, I stand as judge. But the one who enables me to be all of that is you.
Right. Beautiful.
And if you don't see that in me, I'm not any of that.
Right.